I hope you are all keeping safe. I am Economies Financial Sector Advisor within the Secretariat of Making Finance Work for Africa. And it is indeed my pleasure to welcome you today to this webinar we are co-hosting with the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation on the topic of the Legal Entity Identifier, the key to unlocking financial inclusions in developing economy. As you may know, the limited transparency in African businesses, especially SMEs and local business, is often perceived and considered a major challenge to expanding trade finance portfolio, and is among the major constraints to provide appropriate trade finance solutions to African enterprises. In 2018, in a report named SME Competitiveness in Africa, Data for De-risking Investment, the International Trade Center stressed that in time when transparency and availability of data are at premium, greater effort to ensure that national stakeholders in the continent have the necessary information to signal the SME reliability and attractiveness to potential investor is key. And indeed, the importance of trusted.
And your sound cut out.
Please, okay,
you're back.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you are back.
Yes, I'm back. So just saying that the importance of trusted identity is just very critical in relation to the Africa trade finance gap, and anything that can be done to minimize the obstacle to finance provision to SME should be pursued with enthusiasm. The webinar will reflect on the result of the international flagship project aimed to strengthen financial inclusions in Africa by supplying legal entity identifiers to SME and enabling them to apply for trade finance, establish contractual arrangement with bank, payment network, and trading partner, leading to broader access to financial services and greater participation in domestic and international market. The project itself was launched with the support of the German federal government through his development agency, the German International Development Agency. It is a collaborative effort with the Global Legal Entity Identifiers, GLEI, Regulation and Inclusion Center, Cornerstone Advisory Plus, and the NB Bank in Zimbabwe, and the London Stock Exchange Group. In Making Finance Work for Africa, we have identified the need to strengthen AML, CFT, and CFTP, which counter financial proliferations, compliance systems and practice in African jurisdictions. We have identified the need to strengthen these AML, CFT, and CFP compliance systems and practice in African jurisdiction to combat financial crime and enhance the integrity of the financial sector. Promoting initiatives such as the LEI is considered an integral part of our program to strengthen compliance system and practice in African financial sector, which aim to forge partnership with African and international partners to achieve this paramount objective. Today, we have distinguished panelists from these organizations who have agreed to come and share their project experience. The session itself will be moderated by Mrs. Claire Rollet, who is the head of business operations at the GLEIF. But before we delve into the topic of today, I would like to briefly introduce you, as you can see in the outline, introduce you to share the housekeeping with you, which are some practical information that will help interact with the panelists and with the speaker. I will then share some highlights on Making Finance Work for Africa before handing over to the main moderators. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. For housekeeping information, just for your information, actually the session of today will last, I think it will last a bit shorter than that. It will be 1 hour and 15 minutes, which is 75 minutes actually, including the Q&A. And for a good quality of this experience, we will have all the microphones that will be muted to avoid any interference. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A boxes, and you can submit your question at any time during the presentations. Also be aware that the slide and the recording of this presentation will be shared with all attendees and the registrants, and they will also be made available on the Making Finance of Africa website. You can message the organizer if you have any experience, if you encounter any difficulty in connecting with the platform. And finally, we'll have a survey that will pop up at the end of the sessions, and we invite you to fill in the survey just to provide the feedback that we need to improve our future webinars. Next slide. Yes. Let me take this opportunity to share some highlights with you on Making Finance Work for Africa, which is actually a multi-donor initiative that is hosted by the African Development Bank. It provides a unique platform and a critical resources for governments, private sectors, and development partners in Africa, really to support the development of African financial systems, with the objective really to achieve sustainable growth and the resilience of our economies. What we do essentially, as you can see here, is actually to identify emerging challenges and opportunities through research and knowledge management, facilitate joint actions for development, joint action between development partners and African stakeholders, really to improve alignment in their interventions. And we also provide the platform for knowledge exchange, cooperations, and networking among financial sector stakeholders. And we would like to acknowledge the support of this partner that you see the logo at displays here: the African Development Bank, Afrexim Bank, the Agence Française de Développement, the European Investment Bank, and the German Corporation, and also the Dutch corporations. Their generous support has really been very critical for us to deliver on our activities. Next slide, please. On that, I will now hand over the floor to our main moderator, which is Mrs. Claire Rollet. She will continue with this session. Claire, can now take it.
Thank you, Hugh, and welcome to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here speaking with you today. My name is Claire Rowley. I manage the business operations at the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, or the GLEIF for short. For our presentation today, I will start with giving you a very brief background on the global LEI system, LEI, as well as the recent report that Hugh mentioned. First, I stop and ask if everyone is able to hear me adequately. Okay. I don't see any no's, so I think that is okay. So if we go to yes, thank you to everyone in the chat. Also, for those of you using the chat, please feel free to provide questions as we go along, and we'll be very pleased after we have our panel discussion to discuss those questions. So with that, I will turn to the next slide and give you a very brief background on the global LEI system and the LEI. The system itself is an open, public, global system for legal entity identification. It was born out of the financial crisis in 2008, when the leaders of the G20 nations came together and had as an objective to create this global system to support transparency in all types of financial transactions. We have a three-layer governance structure. At the top is something called a Regulatory Oversight Committee, which is composed of over 70 regulators from around the world that set the policy for evolving the system. In the middle, you have the foundation, GLEIF, that I represent. We are responsible for the operations of the system. And then you have 39, what are referred to as local operating units. These are organizations from around the world that have the practical link to the legal entities. They have the knowledge of how to validate and verify legal entity reference data and hold the contract with each and every legal entity represented in the system. The LEI itself is a very simple concept. It's a 20-digit code associated and attached to reference data like the name, the address that describes the legal entity. It is a code that is owned by the respective legal entity. All of that associated reference data is made freely available by the GLEIF in an easy format, so you can access it via online search, a file download, or even API for those of you that are looking for a more technical connection. The LEI itself is based on an ISO standard, and it is recognized globally as a norm. Within the Africa continent, we have roughly 9,000 LEIs that are issued exist today. That is out of the population of 1.2 million. Clearly, we have work to do to grow the LEI population in Africa. That is also one of the drivers behind our most recent initiative. That is the project that you see here, the key to unlocking financial inclusion in developing economies. I give you just a bit of background as to how we came to develop this project, this study. And the initiative started all the way back in 2019. At that time, GLEIF commissioned McKinsey to conduct a study on behalf of GLEIF. And that study concluded that broader use of the LEI could save the global banking sector 2 to 4 billion annually in client onboarding costs alone. And client onboarding was just one area where one business banking activity where the LEI could help to enhance efficiencies and reduce costs. In particular, the study also highlighted that there's great benefits to other business lines, such as trade financing and payments. Following this study, we at GLEIF, we introduced an operating model called the validation agent. This enables banks to generate LEIs for their clients as part of their customer due diligence procedures. And we feel this is a win-win engagement for all of the involved participants. For the financial institution, it leads to efficiencies in their operations. For the bank client that is obtaining the LEI, it gives access to a globally recognized identity. And for the global LEI system, it helps to achieve the original goals put forward by the leaders of the G20 nations, that is to have a truly global system of open, high-quality legal entity identifiers. If you go to the next page here in our slide presentation, you'll see some of our objectives with this pilot project. First and foremost, we like to introduce this validation agent operating model in the Africa continent and to engage with financial institutions to expand LEI issuance, in particular to small and medium-sized businesses. And then we have a strong focus on the benefits for the bank client or the legal entity. Having access to a globally recognized identity credential is key to opening doors, for example, to other business relationships, such as supply chain, trade finance, etc. By providing a small business an LEI, all of that small business partners will then have access to the basic information to know who am I doing business with via this open global system for legal entity identification. And certainly as another objective, we like to explore also the benefits for financial institutions and regulators in the Africa region. That includes enhancing risk management by enhancing assessments of micro and macro prudential risk, as well as making it easier to monitor for market abuse or financial fraud. So with that, I will turn now to the panel where we will discuss further some of our findings and lessons. As Hugh mentioned in the beginning, I'd like to acknowledge GIZ. This initiative, this project was realized with the support of the German federal government through the GIZ. If we turn to the next page here, you will see an overview of the different parties that will be presenting today. And you will see it is a very diverse grouping of participants. We have representatives coming from the local community in Zimbabwe, NNB Bank. We have also regional representatives through Senfree and Cornerstone. We have a global financial markets intermediary, London Stock Exchange Group, and then also a representative of GLEIF, a global identity provider. Truly, each of these parties is necessary to bridge the divide between local knowledge and business practices and enable small businesses to establish their identity digitally to connect to global markets. With that, I will briefly introduce each of our panel participants and then ask each of the panel participants to describe her or his organization's motivation for participating in the pilot. I will just go through the organizations alphabetically and then turn over to each of the panel participants. We have coming from Senfree, Masiwa Ruzare. Masiwa is currently the integrity lead at Senfree. He has over 15 years experience working on financial integrity, illicit financial flows, financial development, and sustainable development goals across the private, public, and non-for-profit sectors. Masiwa has led research across Africa and the developing world. He has led training and capacity building of regulators, compliance officers, and other stakeholders on these issues in Africa and other developing countries. A big welcome to Masiwa from Senfree. We also then have Jan Dekver from Cornerstone Advisory Plus. Jan has over 20 years of experience in audit, operational risk, compliance, and anti-money laundering policy in West Africa. He has worked within organizations such as Citibank and global audit firms. During his 10 years spent at Citibank, he worked across a range of key initiatives as Vice President and Regional Chief Compliance Officer for the West Africa cluster. Jan joined Cornerstone Advisory Plus in 2017 as Managing Director. He continues to work on compliance assignment, assisting banks to bring their compliance framework to international standards. We have also a representative from London Stock Exchange Group, Alberta Abbey. Alberta is having some difficulties connecting, but we will continue to try to bring her into the panel discussion. Alberta has been with London Stock Exchange Group since 2017. Prior to this, she worked at the International Financial Data Services. She also held roles at World First, Bruin Dolphin, and Bank of America. She has over 10 years financial services experience, starting her career at First National Bank of Chicago, focusing on ISDA derivatives confirmation. We have then from GLEIF, Buchu Mintisoglu Tunser. Buchu joined GLEIF in 2018, and she is a senior business relations and policy research manager. In this capacity, she is leading GLEIF's public consultations, managing the globally important financial institutions relationship group, engaging in several validation agent program initiatives, as well as other business development projects. Prior to joining GLEIF, Buchu worked at the Ministry of Economy at Turkey, where she was a senior international trade specialist for 8 years. She obtained her master's degree in Asian studies from the Middle East Technical University in Turkey and also in international affairs from the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And then last but not least, to Erasmus Bunu of NNB Bank Limited. Erasmo is the head of business banking for NNB Bank. In this role, he has the oversight of corporate banking, the agribusiness, and SME banking. Erasmus is a seasoned banker with over 20 years experience in small business development, corporate lending, credit risk, structured opportunities, and customer relationship management. Currently, he is involved in various SME development initiatives, working with partner NGOs and DFIs operating in Zimbabwe. And previously, he worked for Standard Chartered Bank in various senior roles. Following the panel, we will then have Mr. Sekun Magoyo of Copperwares, who is Finance and Administrative Manager, who will give some closing remarks on the benefits of the LEI. Without further ado, I would like to now turn over to our panelists to each make some introductory remarks on his or her organization's motivation for participating in the pilot. And I will turn first to Masiwa. We can take down the slides to allow the panelists to speak. Thank you. To you, Masiwa. And Masiwa, you're not, yes, we hear you now.
Thank you very much, Claire. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Masiwa.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you, Mr. Kamewe. And good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everybody on the who is attending the webinar. As Claire has introduced, my name is Masiwa Rosare. I'm with Centri, that's Center for Financial Regulation and Inclusion, based in Cape Town. Essentially, this project fits very well in the work that we do, mostly on AML/CFT, anti-money laundering and countering terrorism financing. We do in Africa and the link with development objectives or development outcomes, such as financial inclusion and overall development. So for us, we see this objective as opening, this project as opening key opportunities for financial sector players who are normally quite burdened with AML/CFT obligations, and how they can leverage this initiative actually to enhance their KYC and CDD processes. But also we see this opening opportunities for small scale players such as MSMEs to actually be able to play a critical role in the global marketplace, because by having the global identity, they are then able to exploit some of the global opportunities and reduce the risks. So overall, we see this as very integral and important in terms of enhancing not only financial sector outcomes, but also regional and continental level objectives, including under African continental free trade agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Masiwa. And to Jan, to give your perspective on your organization's motivations.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much. And thanks to all the participants. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in your time zone. Thank you for joining us for this discussion that I hope will be interesting for each participant. In Cornerstone Advisory Plus, actually our mission as an advisory boutique, especially on the compliance advisory services of our organization, is to help local and regional African banks to bring the compliance and AML/CFT frameworks up to the international standards. And this is in order to bridge the gap in terms of trade finance via international correspondent banking. Our motivation to join this project is that this flagship project is totally matching this vision and mission that I just mentioned as part of compliance advisory services of our organization. And we saw in this pilot project opportunities for the financial African system to open up to the rest of the world, to strengthen the correspondent banking relationships, and then imply reinforced and stronger inclusion of SMEs in the global economy and global financial system. So yes, we were very excited to work in this project, and we think that there are a lot of things that we can leverage off of this project for the continent and in next phases. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. And now I turn to Alberto. Welcome. Glad to see you were able to join. If you could give some of the motivations for London Stock Exchange in joining this project.
Hello, thank you all. London Stock Exchange is a major global LEI issuer. And this year, we've gone into partnership with NMB Bank to facilitate a wider adoption of the LEI across Africa. So we're providing a platform, and we aim to make the LEI easily accessible in the region. And we do hope that this partnership will encourage more entities across Africa to obtain the LEI. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberta. I then will turn to Burcu to describe the motivations of GLEIF.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claire. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And indeed, GLEIF led this project with extremely valuable contributors, as you see on your screen now. And we very much appreciate everyone's contribution there. Our main motivation with this project was to extend the validation agent program that Claire briefly described in her introduction to financial institutions in African continent, and change our focus or move our focus to more on the aspects and benefits for the small and medium enterprises. So we have found that the LEI is not only valuable or useful for large corporates and large financial institutions, but also for small financial institutions and their small, medium sized enterprises clients. In this project, we wanted to understand how the LEI can help to reduce the informality gap in the short run, and by establishing the globally recognized legal entity for all SMEs, how the LEI can help to ease trade finance gap and de-risking in the region.
Thank you, Burcu. And then, as I mentioned, last but certainly not least, to Erasmus to describe NMB Bank's motivation.
Thank you, Claire. NMB Bank is one of the largest commercial banks operating in Zimbabwe. And maybe for our motivation, I'll give some little bit of context of how our banking industry landscape and our economy is designed. So you find that in Zimbabwe, 60% of the working population comes from SMEs. 50% of GDP derived from SMEs, and over 70% of businesses that operate in Zimbabwe are SMEs. And our exports, 25% of our national exports come from SMEs. So from that context, you would see how important are SMEs to the overall banking sector in Zimbabwe. And you then find out that despite that huge contribution at employment and revenue side, the support that SMEs have been getting has been quite minimal from funders, suppliers, even customers, mainly because of issues to do with identification, legality, and so forth. So the coming in of LEI will help to address some of the challenges that SMEs face in terms of being connected to the banking industry, compliance issues, finance raising, and even connecting to the entire world in terms of trade finance. So we developed some good interest there because obviously that's where we draw the bulk of our customers in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Erasmus. And that is a perfect transition into some of our questions here for the panel. And I thought maybe, Erasmus, if you could go a little bit deeper, thinking specifically of the trade finance. As you mentioned, that the access for SMEs, for small businesses to financial products, financial services can be very difficult. And we see here in the ebook also some statistics that come from the IFC that demonstrate there is a trade finance gap of roughly $81 billion US, and that is for African economies. With this statistic in mind, do you have some examples or maybe some stories of the barriers that your clients, your small business clients, face when they are trying to engage in trade finance?
Yes, sure, Clay. I can share some live examples that most of the SMEs face in terms of conducting trade finance. For starters, you'll find that with tight AML guidelines, most international banks pay close attention to the flow of funds. So in our case, we have seen that most of the small businesses, when they make international payments, the amount of communication that we do with our correspondent banks trying to justify who they are is quite long. In some instances, the discussions can go for over 45 days trying to clear a transaction with international bank. And if you look at a period of days with someone, so working capital logged, whilst banks are discussing, it's a big cost to financial, to SMEs. This other second thing is you'll find that because of small capacities that SMEs do in their trade, they are not able to do business with the large out there. So normally they link with other SMEs in other countries. And the issue of verifying the type of people that they are dealing with, whether suppliers or customers, is quite an issue. So we have had a number of customers who have lost their money because they did pay to unscrupulous people, or they receive substandard because they are not in a position to even verify who they are dealing with in the global arena. I think those are the most two key issues that we find our customers facing. And with the coming in of LEI, I think it gives a very good platform to cross-check before any transaction is done, whether a supply contract or a financial transaction.
Thank you. And Jan, I then will transition to you. Erasmus just described some of the difficulties, especially in establishing the correspondent banking flows. If you could just give a bit more detail on how identity is such an important cornerstone in those interactions with correspondent banking relationships or for fulfilling KYC requirements as established by local authorities.
Thank you very much, Clara. I will attempt to address both of your questions because establishing identity via the LEI can help for both correspondent banking relationships and also fulfilling KYC requirements as per local regulations. Starting with correspondent banking relationships, we know, and I think the Making Finance Work for Africa has done a lot of work on this. We know that African financial institutions are currently struggling to access international correspondent banking networks. And it's either because they do not have the critical size required in terms of volume of activity. When I say required, I mean required by the international correspondent banks, or as equally important, usually because they are not always fully compliant with international AML, CFT, and KYC standards, as well as the international sanctions regime. As a result, then, the African financial system is widely perceived as high risk by the international financial community. And as a result then of this, because of this high risk perception, the international banks have formed the assumption that establishing links with African financial institutions would lead to costly due diligence processes. Clara, I think you mentioned during your presentation that a study conducted by McKinsey revealed that onboarding costs were at least would amount at least $2 billion. So there are enormous costs to onboard any customer, especially another financial institution. So the international banks and financial institutions have formed this assumption that, because of the high risk perception that they have on financial African institutions, onboarding them would be very costly, which would totally outweigh the potential additional revenue generated by the transaction fees that they could incur from having a relationship with those African institutions. And the outcome of this risk versus rewards analysis usually prevents these international banks from establishing links with the financial African institutions, naturally. which can lead them to severing the ties from existing relationships, which is a phenomenon called de-risking, commonly called de-risking. So basically, this high-risk perception of of African financial institutions by the international financial community first can prevent the onboarding of African financial institutions in the international correspondent banking network as a whole. And it can even reduce the current amount of relationship that we have via the phenomenon called de-risking. And as a consequence of this de-risking phenomenon, a recent report from the African Development Bank and Afrexim Bank shows that the continent's trade finance gap is estimated at about $81 billion, largely due to compliance and KYC issues. The broad usage, a broad usage of the LEI can certainly provide greater transparency in the African financial system by providing the financial African system with a sound global unique identification to banks and bank customers, alleviating the responsibility and cost from the international banks. As we've seen, the cost is a huge component of the decision making. And as discussed before, those institutions make their onboarding decision based on risk and reward analysis with two key components, as said already, compliance costs and potential revenues they can get from those relationships with African financial institutions. So if the LEI allows them to reduce some of the compliance costs, it certainly reinforces the position of the African financial institutions that have adopted the LEI for them and their customers towards the international correspondent banking community. This would also definitely help to improve the risk perception for individual banks that have adopted the LEI, together with the perception of the African financial system itself. And we hope that it will open the African financial system to a worldwide network of international financial institutions. And it would certainly help support the effective inclusion of African financial institutions in the global economy. Reversing the trend of de-risking by fostering transparency of the African financial system through the broad adoption of the LEI could definitely help reduce this trade finance gap of $81 billion that I referred earlier in my discussion. Cla, if you allow me in 1 or 2 minutes, in terms of fulfilling the local regulatory requirements, banks that participate in this LEI initiative and taking the role of validation agent can definitely leverage their existing KYC process to obtain LEIs for their customers with minimal to no additional steps, depending on each bank's, of course, KYC framework. And as a result, participating banks can obtain strong global business IDs for their customers and help them to address globally recognized verification processes while streamlining, this is the interesting part, for the fulfilling the local regulatory requirements. The LEI will allow them to also streamline the internal processes for periodic KYC renewals, ongoing customer information updates, and definitely the banks who adopt the LEI for themselves and the customer will reinforce also the internal KYC system and renewal management, which can definitely give a boost to their compliance with local regulatory requirements as well. Another key benefit is that having an LEI or being in the LEI global system can definitely facilitate identification of parent links, therefore facilitating the, in the establishment of the beneficial ownership links that is now a requirement for, the customer due diligence that banks have to conduct as per FATF requirement that has actually been translated into most national jurisdictions. So to conclude on that, strategically participating banks can benefit from improved risk perception. This is one within the international financial community, ultimately leading to increased trade capacity and correspondent banking network, increase the correspondent banking network and their market share of the trade finance activity of their institution. I will stop there, Claire, and if any other question from the panel, we can definitely develop on that subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. And indeed, I think you made nice phrase there with the risk-reward relationships, and also with this project, we try to lower the risk and increase the reward for engaging in these type of relationships. And a reminder to the audience, please feel free to put your questions into the chat area. Je vois qu'il y a aussi quelques participants francophones. N'hésitez pas à poser vos questions aussi en français. So I will turn now back and go to Sinfrey to Masiwa, noticing that there's already a few questions in the chat about trade and different pacts that maybe the LEI could be leveraged in. I'll ask you, Masiwa, from a regional perspective, what are some of the use cases where a global identity could be leveraged to establish greater trade or exchanges within Africa?
Thank you very much, Claire, for that. Unfortunately, I won't be able to put in on my camera because of low bandwidth. Hope that is fine. So generally, the trade remains the key pathway to development for a lot of countries, developed as well as developing countries alike. And actually much more importantly for developing countries. And that's the reason why a lot of countries at the moment in Africa are involved in one regional or international trade agreement of one form or the other. But however, in spite of this, intra-Africa trade is still quite low. I think it's hovering around between 15 to 20%, which means Africa trades less with itself than it does with outsiders. But obviously, if you take into account the role of cross-border trade in there, it's likely to be a little bit of a different picture. Now, and that's really quite important, and that's why these regional agreements that we have under SADC COMESA are important, but more recently, Africa Continental Free Trade Area is essentially to want to boost that regional and continental trade. One key use case of this is, so cross-border trade, and if given the background that Mr. Bunu mentioned earlier on in terms of the role of MSMEs in the economy in Zimbabwe. It's not just a Zimbabwe picture, it's more or less the general picture across Africa, where really MSMEs play a significant role in terms of economic activity and livelihoods. So having an LEI amongst MSMEs actually helps to enhance this cross-border trade. A lot of challenges that coming with cross-border trade, including increased costs and delays at the borders for one reason or the other. But with an LEI, which is actually globally verifiable, that actually makes it much more easier, especially for MSMEs and women-owned businesses. As we all know that women face different and significant challenges, women-owned businesses than men-owned businesses. And ADB did a study on that and actually found out that the stakes were really against the women-owned businesses. And so this is one way of actually enabling that. And we know if you zoom in into the cross-border trade, you actually find a lot of the people that are active there are women, you know, and so having an LEI actually helps them actually to better trade, but also helps enhance this cross-border trade and enables the easy verification of the different trade transactions that happens across the borders. If you look on average in a number of countries, I mean, the borders in a number of countries, there is a lot of costs that are accumulated due to delays, due to manual processes, you know, and so having an LEI that really is globally verifiable, but that, you know, links different MSMEs across different countries. Also, there's an opportunity there of promoting the interoperability and making it easy to actually verify that. The other important aspect apart from the cross-border trade is really its role in enhancing digitization and digitalization. We all know that there is the digitization and technology is developing at a fast pace. Countries, institutions, as well as regulators are all trying their best to keep pace with that. And so actually an LEI leapfrogs that, you know, it helps institutions, it also helps MSMEs actually ride that wave, you know, and ensures that, you know, a lot of these MSMEs and institutions are actually ahead of the curve and not always at the back end, and are able to reap some of the opportunities that come with that. But also, if we look further, it also allows or really forces harmonization of a lot of our contradictory trade regimes and trade policies that we have, as well as policies around, I mean, identification, you know, and all that. So I think that's really one of the key advantages, and over and above that, actually enhancing e-commerce, e-commerce across countries. Another important aspect for that is actually, you know, having an LEI helps also in terms of reducing illicit financial flows and illicit activities that are actually bleeding economies. And at the core of illicit financial flows and activities is the issue of anonymity, right? And so it's anonymity across the different players, different stakeholders. But when you have economies that are dominated by MSMEs or SMEs, you know, and you are then able to digitally verify them in terms of their identities, I think that helps a lot in terms of addressing that. But also with rising, as you know, within the AML-CFT framework, illicit financial flows is one of the key predicate offense, right? So it's an offense that actually underlies money laundering, and which actually further enhances the risk perception and ultimately reduces investment opportunities. So having a handle of that actually has significant and positive knock-on effects going forward. But also the role that all this does in terms of enhancing financial inclusion. A lot of countries actually do financial inclusion strategies in Africa, and it's something that has been promoted at the regional level as well by the different bodies. But if you the exclusion is also based on actually being able to identify those excluded populations, you know, and if you are able to provide identification to the MSMEs who would otherwise, some of them, not be identified, and still, but the need to trade is still there. The need to want to trade is still there, and so they will find one way or the other, you know, of still continuing their activities, but doing it in an unregistered and unregulated way. So it also has that advantage of enhancing some of the policy objectives, such as financial inclusion. The role on compliance, Jan touched on that, reduction in compliance costs and the impact that has on KYC and CDD opportunities for financial institutions, and further what actually they demand, or actually what they ask from the institutions. If they are not able to identify an institution or an individual by default, that individual is a high risk, because you don't know who they are, right? And according to AML CFT framework, you are supposed to have enhanced due diligence on such individuals. So it's either you are requiring them to produce more information and document to transact with you, or actually you are removing them from your system, which actually feeds into financial exclusion. So some of those things are quite important and significant. And I think an LEI for MSMEs is really one of the key tools to actually enhance not only institutional objectives, but national as well as regional objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Masiwa. And you mentioned some of those difficulties in validation verification for business partners within the African continent. I will turn to Alberto, who will give us a bit more detail on some of those challenges.
Thank you, Claire. So the first step of validating the LEI request is to check the details that are submitted by the requester against the details that are held on the registration authority website for the country where the company is registered. In Africa, we find that out of the 54 countries that we're looking at, 11 of the countries, their registration authorities do not have websites at all. 13 of the countries, there are websites, but it is not accessible. Actually, we could find all the information we need to validate an LEI request on only 6 country websites. So out of the 54 countries, it's only 48 countries that we can easily, validate the request by just going to the website, putting the information of the requester or the company information on the website, and then comparing the details that has been submitted against what is held by the registration authority. In that case, we move to the next step, where we actually ask the requester to submit official registration documents in order to validate the LEI request. But one of the benefits of partnering with the African Validation Agent, NMB, is that with their local knowledge and expertise, we're hoping that the validation will become less challenging. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberta. And I'll give the closing word on the panel to Buchu. She has led validation agent engagements across different regions within GLEIF and our efforts. And I'd ask Buchu, what could you identify as making this project so special and different from some of the other engagements? To you, Buchu.
Thank you, Claire. Indeed, GLEIF introduced the validation agent model at the beginning of 2020, last year, and onboarded our first validation agent, JP Morgan, in October. Validation agent program enables financial institutions to provide the LEI, a globally recognized business identifier, to its clients as a byproduct of their client identification and KYC procedures. And when we look to JP Morgan and other large financial institutions that are in our pipeline now for becoming a validation agent, we see that they particularly aim to enhance their data management processes and to achieve greater consistency with standardized legal entity reference data, so that, for example, JP Morgan New York now can speak the same language with JP Morgan Cape Town when they onboard the same client, thanks to the LEI. So there's no ambiguity that the names or abbreviations brings. Of course, the same applies to onboarding the same entity across different business lines of the same financial institution. So basically, the LEI enables automation and straight-through processing, which translates to efficiency, reduction of time and burden for large financial institutions. And if we move our focus from these large financial institutions to NMB Bank, of course, we see that the project with the NMB Bank was very special and different from day one, as our main objective was to test and demonstrate the value of the LEI for smaller financial institutions and also small and medium-sized enterprises. And we want really to test the role of the LEI in de-risking by creating this globally recognized business identifier. For instance, International Finance Corporation of World Bank highlights LEI as one of the emerging innovations for efficiency and effectiveness of a bank's efforts to comply with AML rules. And they suggest that if respondent banks obtain an LEI for themselves and also for their clients, then they can easily establish the identity of the financial institution and establish the identity of their clients. Erasmus mentioned, for instance, 4 to 5 days it takes to clear a transaction with a correspondent bank. And certainly a big portion of this time spent is due to the challenges related to establishing the identity of the respondent bank and their clients. So with this project, we see that actually World Bank's this recommendation was put into practice, because throughout this project, NMB Bank obtained an LEI for itself and also provided LEI for its clients. So they really closed the circle for creating a globally trusted network, which allows them to establish their and their clients' identity across borders and revitalize or establish correspondent banking relationships seamlessly. In addition to the AML priorities, I think it's also important to mention the very ambitious digitization agenda of the NMB Bank. Once we introduced the project to the NMB Bank, they mentioned that they immediately recognized the value of the LEI and the standardized legal entity reference data for their digitization efforts. This was, I think, quite important and interesting to observe from the very beginning. Again, from a project management perspective, I think there was a really good practice, because since NMB Bank was relatively a small financial institution compared to the other global financial institutions that we are engaging for validation agent projects, we saw that from day one, NMB Bank team brought colleagues from AML, compliance, business banking units, and their back office. So we were all on the same page from day one, and we noted it as a really best practice for our other validation agent projects going forward. So it was really a great pleasure and honor for me and for GLEIF to work with all these colleagues here. And I'm certain that the LEI will enhance visibility of all SME clients across and standardization of trade transaction end to end. And taking this opportunity, Claire, as closing remarks, I really would like to invite other financial institutions, credit bureaus in the line now to reach out to us if you're interested in the validation agent model or further use of the LEI for financial inclusion, compliance, or data management objectives. We would be very pleased to support you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertram. What I would like to do now is to turn to some closing remarks here. We are very lucky to have here joining us today, Mr. Sekin Lugoyo of Copperwares. In the ebook describing the project, we talk about how the use of a standard global identity enables better exchanges across free trade areas or custom procedures. And Copperwares is one of the first mid-sized African companies to get an LEI. So I'd like to turn to Sekin now to make some closing remarks here and share your experience in getting the LEI and your expectations for how it may open some doors for Copperwares. To you, Sekin. And second, yeah, perfect. Thank you.
I got it. Okay. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. Good afternoon to you all. Good evening to some. Good morning to some. I hope you have enjoyed this workshop. It is quite an eye-opener. My name is Sekin Lugoyo, as Claire has already said, with Copperwares, a company that is based in Zimbabwe in Masasa. What we do is we manufacture corporate gifts, personal gifts, sporting event gifts, any gifts that you can think about. we can make it, we are a company that is called, we can make anything to your imagination or beyond. We are a customer to NMB or a banker with NMB. NMB has walked us through the LEI registration process. This journey began, if my memory serves me well, in January, February, thereabouts this year. It's been a journey that we have enjoyed. It's been a journey that has been filled with fun and laughter and enjoyment. From a business point of view, I can say, as Copperways, we are obviously having joined LEI, we do have our own expectations. And the biggest expectation that we obviously have is that of international exposure. In our production processes, we do import 60% of our raw materials. 30% of those raw materials come from Europe, 20% come from China, the other 10–20% comes from within Africa. Primarily with China and Europe, we have to go through quite a long process of clearing our funds because obviously we are not known. No one has cleared us. Everyone thinks we are trying to participate in this financial terrorism. So for our funds to be cleared as legitimate business transaction, it takes a bit of time. And I think Erasmus, my colleague, has already alluded to the fact that that process of clearing funds takes some time. And in that time, our funds are locked up. We don't have access to our funds, but at the same time, we also don't have access to the raw materials that we've paid for. So we expect this LEI to then bring in a seamless process in our transaction. We also expect it to bring in an international business community point of view, wherein we participate, we know who is who, we know who to contact, we know where to search for information, we avoid or stop or limit the exposure to the risk of the fly-by-night businesses. And obviously, once our funds are hedged against such, we then can transact with much confidence. We can transact with speed. We can transact with much more efficiency. And I think obviously there will be benefits from a business point of view, where obviously in us knowing other people, other business players, other colleagues in the business industry, we also expose ourselves to potential markets. So then people will see us, will know about us, will know our product. Then obviously they will also participate in buying and selling from us. So I would like to say thank you very much to LEI. I would like to say thank you very much to NMB. I would like to say thank you very much to everyone. I would like to say welcome to this community wherein we are in this thing together. Let's walk this journey together. Let's do this work together. Let's know each other well. Let's open up. Your benefit is my benefit and my benefit is your benefit. So if we work in this together, all I can see is a great success, and succeeding as a team will take us far. There's a saying that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. So we as Copperways have chosen to go together with LEI. I thank you.
Many thanks, Second. And indeed, I hope that this demonstrates to all of the participants today the great project team, exactly as Second said, we cannot do this alone. Certainly we at the foundation cannot do it alone. We need such a great project team to do this together, to bring to the African continent awareness of the legal entity identifier and the possibilities for doors it can open for easing compliance, enhancing and making easier trade relationships. So I will take a stop there. I will turn to Hugh to see, do we have some minutes to take a few of the questions that are currently in the chat area?
Yes, thank you, Claire. Thank you. Definitely, it has been very engaging. We have received many questions, and I think we still have around 10 minutes to yes, to address some of these questions. Let's go ahead. And I think you may also read some of the answers that you gave to some of the questions that were raised in the Q&A box.
Okay. Thank you, Hugh. So indeed, I will start with a few of the questions, maybe just the practical ones. I believe, Hugh, that indeed the recording will be made available to participants or via the Making Finance Work for Africa website. Is that correct?
Fully correct.
Okay. Indeed, and we will also be working with Making Finance Work for Africa to distribute contact information from the different participants as well. There is a question here that is focusing on the African free trade area. And that is the LEI considering also to leverage within the free trade area arrangement for trade across region and beyond? Currently, you will not find the LEI in the discussion, but this is exactly where we believe it would have very high benefits. And maybe I just turn to Masiwa, as you did talk, Masiwa, about quite some of the benefits within the trade area. If you like to make a few comments on that question.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. So yeah, I think I agree with what you have said. It's so far not featuring a lot, but it's definitely one of the key issues that countries and different stakeholders have to confront and address if we are to achieve the various targets under Africa Continental Free Trade Area. But actually to also flag that it's not just, this is not just important for trade in Africa. At the WTO, World Trade Organization, which is the global body that oversees trade across the world, LEI is also recognized as one of the key instruments or key enabler for trade. So even though in Africa there's still some way to go, but I think it's really something that should be happening, and always we do have the intentions, policy intentions under such arrangements, but we always have perennial issues and perennial challenges in terms of actually rolling the things out and making it happen. So I think that's what needs to happen country by country, where actually you need to enable that. But overall, it's something that also helps in terms of interoperability, and it's something that can be it's a base around which other functionalities or other use cases can actually be developed that link to development objectives.
Thank you, Masiwa. There's a question, and I will direct it to Erasmus and also to Second, and it's about the experience of an SME and getting the LEI. And the question was, what preparation do SMEs need to do, or what obligations would they have to fulfill to get on board with the LEI? I think you see with this project, we aim to make that as easy as possible. So maybe I turn first to you, Erasmus, just to describe how that is now incorporated in your processes, and then Second, also your experience.
Thank you, Claire. So you find for starters is what we then use is your national company registration documents. So this might vary from country to country, but in our case, we have a registrar general where each business, whether registered as a corporate entity or a sole trader, you then get your company documents. So that's where we start in terms of extracting information and getting documents. And over and above that, something digitally that helps us to validate the documents is that each company has got a tax number that we can digitally verify with our Zimbabwe Revenue Authority. So with those documents, we then use them to onboard any customer that we are giving an LEI. Because those documents are easily available, you'll find that registered entities, it's much easier to onboard them on the LEI project. A bit of work is then required where you have a totally informal business that has got no registration. That way we go a step further in terms of working with them to get company documentation. And what we do in the background is that we work with a number of accounting firms that offer very favorable fees in terms of assisting SMEs in registering with our local registrar. Once that process is done and the documents are there, then the LEI onboarding exercise is quite an easy and smooth flow and interesting one to do. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Erasmus. And second, do you like to add anything just from your personal experience in providing the documentation? If there was anything that you found difficult or any comments on the general process? And second, not sure if you have any additional comments there. No. If not, it's okay as well.
No.
Okay, thank you. I will take then one additional question, and this one I will direct to Alberta. Just one moment while I find it again today. It was talking about if there's any country-specific requirements for obtaining an LEI. You mentioned already in your description the registration authority, et cetera, but I thought maybe if you could just give a little bit more overview if there's anything specific to specific countries that's special requirement for obtaining an LEI.
Thank you. So no, the LEI is a global identifier. So no, we, the London Stock Exchange, we're accredited to issue the LEI globally. Some issuers are not, but then it depends on what, it depends on the registration authority. As I went through earlier on, some of the countries do not have published information. So we will request company registration documents in order to validate the LEI, but it is global. It is not country specific, no. And yes, we use the same validation process to validate all the LEIs, regardless of the country where the entity is based.
Perfect. Thank you, Alberta. And we are coming very close to the end now. I will just mention in the Q&A, there is a few responses. There is specifically a few questions that are specific to countries. For example, a representative of Zambia, I believe also of Ghana, that was interested in learning more specific to that country. We will send out contact information following this webinar, and please feel free. We would be very happy, as Buchu mentioned, to have a personal discussion with you to understand what your needs are. There was also a question as to if the LEI, how the LEI is related to enhanced customer due diligence or KYC protocols. And there we clarified that the LEI is not a replacement, but rather it can be used to make your customer due diligence or KYC responsibilities more efficiently conducted. This McKinsey study I mentioned does go into quite some details, and we can provide also the link to that ebook as well. And I will just mention one additional ones. There was a question if a cooperative group or community associations register can have an LEI. The LEI does follow the local legal system. So as Alberto mentioned, it's like a global passport. So if a cooperative group or association is registered and recognized as a legal entity in the local jurisdiction, it also then can register for an LEI. So with that, I see we do have quite a few questions that are still in the Q&A, but I know we are at our webinar in time, and I want to be respectful of all of our panelists' time, all of our participant time. From the GLEIF perspective, I'd like to thank everybody for the interest. I'd like to thank Making Finance Work for Africa for your very generous offer to discuss the project and the ebook today, and I will turn back to Hugh for the closing.
Thank you very much, Claire, for this nice work. It has been very engaging discussions. We receive a lot of comments and questions, which really shows it's clearly a testimony to the interest of the audience for the topic. We, of course, given time constraint, cannot address all the questions, but what we will do jointly with the GLEIF and other participating institutions, we will take them and see if in writing we can prepare some answer. It might not follow just after this webinar or in the timeline that we usually set, but we will send some of the answer to you by email to all the register. Thank you so much again, as I said, to the participants for the enlightening insight that you shared today. It's clear that the potentials for the LEI in helping addressing some of the trade finance and correspondent banking KYC compliance related challenge. It's so obvious, and as you said in the final remarks, that it can really help to conduct efficient KYC due diligence. We also noted that there's additional benefit that comes from the LEI, like improved risk perception, the increase of trade capacity, and the increase of correspondent banking network, enhancement in e-commerce and cross-border trade, and also the potential of reducing illicit financial flow. So there's a lot of benefit around the LEI, and we can just encourage some of our, the African public, really, and particularly the SMEs or corporate, really, to join this process. We are Making Finance as part of our series and part of our activity. We continue to promote this type of initiative that can really help to resolve some of these problems that are related to trade finance, given the massive trade finance gap that exists on the continent. We talk at close to 100 billions. We know also the financial inclusion challenge that are also related to this issue. So I thank you for joining this webinar. We had nearly more than 300 registrants and more than 150, close to 150 attendees at some point, which really shows how the diverse audience that follow this webinar, which include commercial bank, development, representative of commercial bank, development bank. There are also some regulators, and which is really good, and just encourage us to continue with this activity. I will say in the final word that conclude that, as we mentioned, the recording and the presentation will be shared with all the participants when we close this webinar. I mean, probably within 72 hours. So which means less than three days. When we will also wind up the platform, you'll see a survey that will pop up. Please just fill in this survey. We really value your feedback. That really helps us a lot in improving, the qualities of our webinar series. Also really improving the engagement. So we really value it, and we really invite you to submit those to respond to the questions. Thanks to the moderator, thanks to the panelists for your time, and let's continue this cooperation. On that, I would like to say goodbye. Have a very good rest of the day, and let's see you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Goodbye.
Mhm.